So welcome to our first meeting of the new season. I hope that you've been having a wonderful summer full of adventures, and some of you have been sharing your adventures and lots of birds. We missed you during our August hiatus, but we are back with an exciting season of events, activities, and presenters lined up thanks to our wonderful program team led by Sabina Begg and our amazing field trip team led by Paula Guttrell. So sit back with your favorite beverage and snack. I have some a bunch of green tea and some raspberry chocolate. I don't know what you guys have, but hopefully you're enjoying yourselves as you enjoy tonight's meeting. So I'm thrilled to share with you the exciting progress of the Bush Wildlife and Audubon Everglades Plants for Birds Garden on their new campus. This garden is not just a beautiful addition, but a living example of how you can transform your own home's landscape to support wildlife using native plants. It has been made possible through a collaborative effort thanks to the generous support of the NEAT, which is the Neighborhood Transformation and Engagement Grant offered by Palm Beach County. The Bush Wildlife Garden is a result of a strong partnership with Audubon Everglades and Bush Wildlife. The garden's captivating design has been crafted by our newest volunteer, which we're so lucky to have, landscape designer Benjamin Burrell from Yates Design. As an integral part of the Plants for Birds program, we are excited that Bush Wildlife is joining our Purple Martin Ambassadorship program. Shelley Rosenberg, our Purple Martin program manager, will consult in the installation and placement, lead educational programming there at Bush Wildlife, and contribute to the training of their junior naturalist program. So what a great partnership we are now forming with Bush Wildlife Sanctuary as part of our ongoing effort to form these kind of integral partnerships that make conservation possible. Our aim is to inspire a new generation of Purple Martin landlords who share our passion for conservation. Thank you, Shelley Rosenberg, for taking the lead on this. And we are excited to announce that our Plants for Birds Bush Wildlife Garden will be featured as part of this year's Florida Native Plant Society Native Garden Tour. As part of the annual tour organized in collaboration with Palm Beach Florida Native Plant Society and the Atala chapter for the North American Butterfly Association, we are thrilled to announce that this stop on the tour will feature the brand new Bush Wildlife Rocky Pine campus in November. So stay tuned for more information and exciting details as we get closer to the date, including the opportunity to receive native plants as a giveaway when you attend the tour. So please mark your calendar for a momentous occasion, the completion of the garden. The grand opening of this remarkable facility will take place on October 18th, 2023, which is when the new Bush Wildlife Sanctuary, who has moved into their new home, will take place. I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Sabina Begg, our Vice President, whose unwavering dedication and hard work over 3 years has been instrumental in bringing this project to life, our garden and the addition also of the Purple Martin housing, and fostering these invaluable partnerships with places like Bush Wildlife Sanctuary. We could not have done it without Sabina taking the lead on this. This garden is not just a place of beauty, it is a symbol of our commitment to wildlife conservation and education. We look forward to seeing you all at the grand opening, October 18th, and sharing this incredible journey with our community. Thank you so much for everyone who's been involved in this project. The 2023 field trip season has kicked off with a fresh array of exciting journeys. We invite you to explore our Eventbrite page, regularly updated, and I emphasize that word updated because we will be adding even more trips than you're already seeing there, with thrilling new trip opportunities. And we have trips going to the Far Tortugas, there's pelagic trips going out. There's a number of trips out of the county going on. I think we're going to 6 different properties from South Florida Water Management District. And of course, many of the local hot burning sites. So take a look at Eventbrite. Mary will be putting that link into the chat for you, so you'll be able to know where to go and start registering, because you want to be sure to be able to attend some of these trips. And by the way, when you register, if you realize you cannot attend, please unregister, because usually many of these trips will fill up, and we'd like to give everyone an opportunity to attend. So if you realize you cannot go, please unregister yourself by going back to your registration link and giving somebody else an opportunity. And for putting all these trips together, a huge thank you to Paula Guttrell, our field trip coordinator, for doing such an amazing job putting together this great season. Anyway, so once again, a link to the registration will be in the chat. It's already in, I've been told. For October, uncover raven secrets and the dynamic bonds between wolves and humans in Think Like a Raven by our October feature presenter, author, and Nat Geo explorer, Dr. John Marslow. Think Like a Raven is a communication of John Marslow's collaborative work detailing the intertwined lives of ravens, wolves, pumas, and the people that visited and live around Yellowstone. His presentation follows the seasons of Yellowstone and the scientific journey he undertook to decode the mysteries of raven life. You'll hear about the secrets revealed by over 60 tagged birds who flew 100 miles directly to new kills, commandeered territory, found mates, and reared young. And he will describe a picture that emerged from his study of the tenuous and evolving relationship between humans, wolves, ravens, and the challenges animals face when they wander beyond the protection of a national park that a national park provides. So that's upcoming in October. Mary has put the link into the chat. If you'd like to register, you can register now if you'd like, or sometime later, but be sure to register for that exciting presentation. We are so lucky to have Dr. John Marslow as one of our presenters. The Audubon Photography Group will be kicking off their new season this month with an exciting series of presentations. Join us as we view beautiful images created by our photography members of nature, birds, and wildlife, Thursday, September 14th at the Zoom photo share. Members can attend this meeting by registering through an email that will be sent out tomorrow morning. So be sure to check your email. A link to join the photography group and be kept abreast of all their activities will be placed in the chat. So check the chat for that link. Blue Kaufman is back to lead a lively book discussion on Dr. John Marslow's book, Gift of Crows. He is, of course, our October speaker, so you'll get a sense of some of his work with crows, and you'll also you'll learn a lot about crows and ravens, because ravens are included in that book. It's a wonderful book. I read it about 6 months ago, and I hope to join in that discussion as well. Space is limited to 15 participants, so email Blue Kaufman to register and for more information. And Mary will be putting that link into the chat as well. And so we are now excited to bring our feature speaker of the evening, the always engaging and informative Dr. Ken Myers. Introducing Dr. Myers is wildlife biologist and AE's second vice president, Natasha Warich, who is fresh from the field after spending the day doing gopher tortoise surveys north of Lake Okeechobee. So without further ado, I give you Natasha Warich.
I like that I got my own introduction. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So as Scott said, today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Ken Meyer about the research and conservation efforts surrounding 3 raptors that occur in Florida. So we're going to be hearing about the Crested Caracara, the Everglades Snail Kite, and Southeastern Kestrel. So Dr. Meyer is from the Avian Research and Conservation Institute. Dr. Meyer has a bachelor's degree in zoology from the University of Maine and a Ph.D. in zoology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He studied imperiled birds for his post-doctoral studies at the University of Florida's Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, where he is an adjunct professor, and has studied imperiled bird species as a research biologist with the National Park Service. He co-founded the Avian Research and Conservation Institute in 1997 and has held the positions of senior research ecologist and executive director with that organization. He has over 40 years of experience, and he and his team have studied the ecology of 16 species of conservation concern in North, Central, and South America. In 2002 and 2014, he received the Partners in Flight National Research Award, and in 2005, he received the National Wildlife Stewardship Award from the Sustainable Forestry Initiative for cooperative studies of swallow-tailed kites. I'm very excited to hear this presentation tonight, as I'm sure all of you are. Just a few reminders. Please make sure that you remain on mute for the duration of the presentation. And please put all of your questions into the chat, which we'll go over at the end of the presentation. So thank you all so much. Ken, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Natasha. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out on this dark and stormy night. It's so nice to be here. I love doing this. This has always been one of my favorite parts of the job, and it's a very important part of ARCI's mission. As you may have gotten the drift, we focus on birds that are not necessarily listed as threatened or endangered, but are considered imperiled for one reason or another. It might be that they have a small population, or the population is declining, or some resource they need, such as particular habitat or prey, might be disappearing. So our goal is to provide reliable data on birds that are not being studied, or to address questions that are not being addressed, data that will contribute to management and therefore conservation. So that's always been the design. My academic experience was in a theoretical behavioral ecology program in zoology at the University of North Carolina. And I love that. But when I was doing that, there wasn't a whole lot of applied research going on in wildlife. But I knew that's what I wanted to do as soon as I finished. And it took me a while to finish, but came to Florida. And these are some of the species that you see here that we've been studying over the years. And now for the last 23 years, my professional partner has been Gina Kent, who many of you know, I hope. And we are the full-time employees, and we have a wonderful collection, for lack of a better word, of part-time folks who work all around the world, but there are particular projects that they come and join us with at different parts of the year. That's the business model. If you're thinking about starting a nonprofit to study wildlife research in today's world, you need some kind of a tricky business model. And I'll come back to this at the end. I'm going to talk about 3 species. I'll start with caracaras, and then snail kites and American kestrels. And when I started doing this work, I came to UF, did a postdoc studying swallowtail kites. It was a bird we didn't know much about. We didn't know where it went. That all went very well. And there was funding from Florida Fish and Wildlife. They had the non-game grants program, provided a lot of relatively small but very important grants. That disappeared, turned into the state wildlife grants program. This is all federal money coming to the state. But at that point, FWC decided to essentially keep that money within the agency. And as they grew, their staff was taking advantage of those funds to do things that were important, and that's very good. State wildlife grants disappeared. Supposedly there's something else coming down the pike, but we don't know what that's going to look like and how it's going to support, potentially support organizations like us that are trying to fill the gaps in what the agencies may not be able to do, may not have people experienced enough to do, or just have so much else they're trying to do, including live in a very bureaucratic world and the constraints imposed on them by working in Florida, where governments don't necessarily always do the things that are in the best interest of the people and the resources. And that's governments of every color and stripe and all that. So these are not political statements, but it's a reality of conservation, and I think one that we need to think about and talk about a little more often. So yeah, I'm just going to focus on these 3 species, and I think because they're imperiled, snail kites and caracaras are federally listed. The caracara population is listed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as threatened. The snail kites listed by the service as endangered. And the American kestrel, the subspecies that occupies Florida, the Southeastern American kestrel, is listed as threatened by Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Threatened is their single management status, ranking status. It is the most alarming, severe. It's the highest rank. And I think at this point, there are still no more than 28 or 30 species on that list. So there's a lot of other species, the other ones we study, that need a lot of help as well. So caracaras, what an incredible bird, and so fun to watch. You don't have to be a professional scientist to enjoy watching them and see how clever they are and wary, as conspicuous as they are. I mean, they have all kinds of behavioral quirks and tricks that you just wouldn't expect to see in a bird. You wouldn't expect to see it in species we consider much smarter, like ourselves, for instance. But certainly a species of concern. And most of what we know about the behavior and ecology, the basic biology of caracaras, has come from the work of Joan Morrison, which Joan was getting her Ph.D., I think, when I was doing a postdoc at UF. We've known each other a long time. A very, very large and impressive body of work. And I'm saying that not just because I saw her name on the participants list. So hi, Joan, it's great to have you here. And thanks for all you've done over the years. So you can see some of the concerns here. They're very site faithful. Now, that can often be a factor for an imperiled species because they want to keep coming back to the same place. And that's where they will meet their mate. That's where they know where the resources are. The importance of place, the sense of place in wildlife ecology is highly, it's probably underestimated by non-professionals and even some professionals. And I think it's one of the simplest things as humans to understand, because look how we are tied to places. We have our homes, we have places where our family are, or where our offspring move to. We know where the resources are, the food, the safety, the risky things. It's all real similar for birds, and they stand to do better if they come back to that place where they nested in the previous year. And this always comes up when I talk about swallowtail kites, which I refuse to talk about tonight. We don't have enough time. So give me a call if you have a question. But people will often ask, I think one of the main questions people ask is, do they mate for life? And I think we just want some reassurance that idea, and we want to see it represented out there in the wild animal world. And my answer always is with swallowtail kites, and I suspect this applies to crested caracaras as well, and a lot of other birds, if not most of them. The answer is yeah, if it works out. And I don't mean that to be coy, but if they come back to the same place after they perhaps have dispersed off of their breeding territory, off their home range, if they come back to the same place and meet each other, they will continue to mate. And they may do that their whole life if that turns out to happen. Swallowtail kites migrate 5,000 miles each way to their winter range. The pair does not migrate together or with their offspring. But that is how swallowtail kites find their mate. They come back to the same place. And we've been satellite tracking that species since 1996. And we see these amazing tracks where every year, no matter where they hit the southern coast of the United States, when they migrate in the spring from the Yucatan Peninsula, they always immediately, you think they would want to rest, but immediately they turn in the direction of where they nested the last year. And the track ends right at that territory. So if their mate's alive and it does the same thing, they will continue. So that's just, I think, a warm and friendly anecdote. One of the amazing things we found by tracking birds. And that reminds me to say that a lot of what I mentioned tonight in terms of what we've learned have come from the amazing tools associated with telemetry, tracking animals. The oldest kind of telemetry. I love this. They're so cool up there. It's just, watching what's going on, and it makes it look like the nest is easy to find. Well, I'm sure that even after all these years, Joan would tell you that no, they never get easy to find because they're usually in cabbage palms in Florida, and you can't see them well. And that also reminds me, when we collected this data near the Vieira development in Brevard County, there were two pairs, and we were charged with tagging all four members, both members of each pair, on the Vieira development, because that's what the Fish and Wildlife Service asked the developer to do as for mitigation. So we were funded to do that, and this is a track from one of those nests of both members of the pair combined. But this is a good case of showing you how they manage this, the whole idea of territory and home range and nesting in places. If the habitat is good, they were going to have other birds of the same species there. But I digress. What I started to tell you, and amazingly enough, I just remembered it. I don't usually anymore, but we would see a nest. You know, there's one cabbage palm a few hundred yards away, and you see a bird fly into the nest, and you start walking toward it because you want to get a closer look, and you get closer and closer. You don't really ever see the nest, and you don't see the bird. And eventually you get to the nest and you can see, and there's no bird in it. And what they would do in this habitat, especially, I hope you can see my cursor here. So lots of swales. Became a sod farm. It used to be pastures, these swales. So the caracaras would jump off the opposite side of the nest from where you were watching them from 100 yards away. And they'd get down in one of those swales where the bottom is wetter or muddy and soft. And they forage for invertebrates in there. But also what they do is they just walk away. And they go far enough away before they get up and fly that you don't see them. And all of a sudden later you see them flying back into the nest. I don't think that's just a coincidence. I think that's just awesomely cool behavior. So we collected these data. These are GPS fixes, very accurate to within 15, 25 feet. And those data were then sent up to satellites, and that's how we retrieved that information. So this project was funded by the Vieira Company under duress. Fish and Wildlife Service said you have to put up some money, and here's what we'd like to learn. This was done for the Jacksonville office of the Fish and Wildlife Service. They don't get many caracara products up there. It's at the southern end of their range. Caracaras, for the most part, are regulated, managed, studied, whatever, out of the Vero Beach office of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is my chance to tell you right up front, Gina Kent and all her contributions, everything I used to think I knew how to do well, she now does better. And I've gotten great behind a desk, doing administrative things and writing reports, and as often as possible, writing manuscripts, although that's what suffers the most. Gina's been awesome. And everything I talk about tonight, she has been part of, a very, very critical part of. That is a caracara. It's in a witness protection program or something, I guess. I don't know. It's wearing a falconer's hood, which calms the bird down. They can't see. You can tell they're big birds. So here's some of the Vieira data. 2 nests, orange and blue. And these are both sexes combined. So we did tag all 4 birds. It's hard enough to catch a single caracara anywhere. But to catch both members of a pair is very difficult because they watch what happens to each other. And catching both members of 2 pairs on adjacent territories was more challenging than we expected, but we had no experience, so we didn't know how hard it was going to be. And it turned out to be very successful and very revealing. And it turned out to be very important, novel data on home range sizes in this kind of an environment. But here it doesn't look like that anymore. It's been developed, and one of the tagged, the banded caracaras, is still there. So again, the 2 territories, the 2 home ranges rather, all the movements of these birds, they do not transgress that imaginary boundary between these 2 home ranges. We now know from subsequent tracking, and I'm sure Joan's seen this too, that they do in fact overlap to some extent. But in this case, they did not. It was as if there was a fence line between them, and they didn't cross it. So in the top pair, the blue is the male and the magenta is the female. Females have smaller ranges. They were more focused around the nest. These are not year-round distributions. They were about 6 months or so centered around the breeding season. The southern pair, same thing. Green is the male, red is the female. Males were going out there doing most of the hunting. We would have studied them longer. The transmitters that we put on them, some of them on swallowtail kites have lasted 6, 7, over 7 years, providing amazing data. But the caracaras are very good at taking things off. And the mates especially, they would snip the harnesses, very strong material, or they'd break the transmitters, break the antenna off the transmitters of their mates. And we saw this happening. They're also very, very affectionate. On the right side over here, right around here, actually, part of the development had already started. They started with a hospital. That was sort of interesting. I guess they thought they could sell more lots if they had medical care immediately available. So it was a 3-story building, and there was a ledge outside, big windows in the rooms of the hospital. And the female, while waiting for the male to come back with food, would lie down on the ledge, and she could watch her nest. This is the female from this northern territory. And people in the hospital would come to the windows to watch them. And when the male took a break, he would go over there, land next to her, walk up to next to her, and lie down forward on his belly, and he would stroke her with one of his feet, with the talons folded in. Just very affectionate birds. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. That's certainly what it looked like, and I imagine to them that's what it felt like. So one of the birds that's still hanging around that has a color band, it hangs out on that hospital still. Now we do a different kind of caracara work. We are still doing tracking studies, and I'll show you why in a minute, but we're also doing, for consulting companies, sub-consulting, we're doing nesting surveys on lands that are going to be developed. So these are ranch lands in central and southern Florida. These are vital habitats for swallowtail kites. As Joan has put it, there's a goldfish bowl out here, and it's got a certain number of crested caracaras living in it, and we just keep making that goldfish bowl smaller and smaller and think it's going to support the same number of fish. It's not going to. There's no way. What's going on with these pasture lands is it's more financially lucrative to develop them. So the service requires the developers to pay a consulting company who then hires us because we have the expertise, I guess. They hire us to monitor for nesting activity where it's been in the past. But one of the reasons they're doing this is they're developing these pastures into solar fields, Florida Power and Light. So solar fields, when you see them from the air, they look like large rectilinear lakes, shining bronze in the beautiful late Florida sun. In fact, they're former ranch lands and caracara habitat. Here's one watching. This is a member of a pair that's nesting within less than 30 or 40 meters of that piece of heavy equipment, which is clearing its nest site already. That was an adjacent development that was going on. And on the bird on the left, you can see the transmitter. Again, GPS fixes, in this case on caracaras, being sent to us via cell phone connections. That gives you an idea of what a home range looks like when you include all the points. So there's these extraneous points, and this is sort of an academic point, but it has biological significance. So this one bird from it's called the Brighton Valley Project. It was on Mike's brother's land. This one bird obviously spent most of its time here, and its nest is roughly in the center of the densest fixes. These are all GPS locations, highly accurate. They also spend some time over here. And sometimes these areas, even though they're disjunct and some distance, they may be particularly good foraging areas. That might be a refuge where they can rest without any threat of being disturbed by predators or heavy construction equipment. But you can see one of the prominent features in habitat for caracaras is the source of their food. As you follow the cursor, roadkill. So that's become one of the dominant predictive features of where caracaras will nest. Open grasslands, something that looks like grasslands, with cabbage palms they can nest in scattered. If it's behind barbed wire and there aren't a lot of people going in and causing disturbance, that's a good thing too. But roads and roadkill are the source. The other source is cattle that die, get struck by lightning, die in childbirth, or calves that die, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just an idea of what the cell phone delivered GPS fixes look like for three different birds in the Brighton Valley area. So you can zoom in to extreme resolution on this to a very small area. I can't do it here. You can imagine it gives you a fine, very, very fine sense of what the caracaras are doing. And this is just a beautiful picture of the parents hanging out in the shade while their daughter is waiting for something to eat, and they are making out over there on the limb. See, that's the drag about this. I mean, I think it's so cool that so many of you are on this call, and I didn't have to drive anywhere to do this, but I can't see you, and that's hard. So I assume at least somebody laughed when I said that. But if you didn't, that's okay too. I don't take it personally. I'm having a good time anyway. But it's I don't want you to distrust the reliability of our data by me sounding like I love birds and I love learning about birds like this. And I'm incredibly fascinated every year, more so. And that just reminds me to say something now so I don't forget. How can we lose this? How can we let this go? It's just unfathomable to me. And it reminds me to thank you all for doing what you're doing, for showing up, but for showing up all the time to hear about what your chapter's doing and what you're contributing to in your chapter that very, very thoughtful, busy people are creating and doing good for conservation. There's not a lot of chapters in Florida that do it on this large scale, but it sure is a pleasure to visit with you and to know that you're out there doing it. On that note, I wish I had time to say, Joan, tell us some more, but I'm going to move on to snail kites instead. And Gina said my collaborator on this is Phil Darby, who studied apple snails forever and ever. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service, it seemed to take a long time to come to the realization that if we want to manage for snail kites, we need to manage for, fill in the blank. Yes, apple snails. And managing for apple snails means having some control over a highly manipulative hydrologic landscape. Now, it looks like Conservation Area 3A here looks like historic Everglades. It has emergent spike rush, different kinds of Elaeochris and such. And that's where snails come up near the surface and they stick their little periscope up and they breathe. And that's where snail kites come down and grab them. It is incredible. Another one of those amazing facts that you just have to be in awe of is that kite holding that snail may have been sitting, half a football field away from a snail that came up on a piece of vegetation and made a beeline from its perch and grabbed that snail before it released, got enough air and released and went down to the bottom. And they do that all the time. They do it every day. So one of the remarkable things about snail kite conservation, one of the gifts, I think, is this is a bird that is the snail kite. It eats one thing mainly. It does eat a lot of crayfish. And if Mark Cook is on in the audience here, I know he appreciates that. And it's an understudied and undervalued prey for snail kites, especially when they can't find snails, but especially for other species such as white ibis and such. So anyway, here we go. We did get involved about 6 years ago. Phil Darby hired us basically to take over the contract of snail sampling, Conservation Area 3A. That conservation area in the late 90s for several years was the center of abundance for breeding snail kites in the United States. And that ended in the early 2000s. And last year, there were no snail kites in Water Conservation Area 3A. So why did that happen? It didn't happen because the water disappeared. There's a lot of water there at some times of year, but there's not enough water there long enough to accommodate the nesting cycle of snail kites. And the water is dropping now every year. Not dropping because it decided to, it's being manipulated because it's going somewhere else. And a large part of where it's going is to the Everglades to restore the southern part, the less disturbed Everglades National Park, part of the Everglades, and to hydrate all that python habitat. So snail kites, they have a very specialized diet that could be a blessing and a curse. They have isolated geography. They live on a peninsula. They don't have a lot of places to radiate out to. North is it, and they are limited by temperature and hydrology, the availability of water and snail populations. They have a population threshold because they are limited in where they can go in Peninsular Florida, and the water in Peninsular Florida does not occur and linger, and it doesn't behave like it did years ago because it's been highly managed. So altered hydrology and conflicting demands for water. Now, I will compliment the water management system in Florida because it's incredibly successful, incredibly well done. You know, the rate at which water can be moved in response to, say, an approaching hurricane, or in response to large agricultural lands needing more water to get their crops to market. Now, that latter demand for water, and of course, residential needs for water as well, flushing all those toilets and such. So that need for water temporally, seasonally, does not necessarily agree with the snail kite's need for water with regard to its breeding cycle. So snail kites are pretty big birds, and it takes them 28 days to hatch eggs, and then it takes them 45 days to get nestlings to the age where they can leave the nest. And then it's another several weeks before the young are totally independent. And that's the problem. This is Conservation Area 3A. This is beautiful snail habitat, beautiful snail kite habitat. The problem is those people who work for ARCI are measuring the density of snails with a throw trap. And there are almost no snails in Conservation Area 3A anymore. They're way below the threshold necessary to support snail kite nesting. And the reason for that is, in a nutshell, I can tell you, is the water in that area does not always look like that. It is not always that deep. The water moving south from Lake Okeechobee that's going to Everglades National Park, it now has to have maximum levels of, it cannot exceed maximum levels of phosphorus primarily. That's the element that does the most destruction by accelerating growth of vegetation, including unfortunate vegetation. So if the water isn't low enough in phosphorus, and I'm grossly oversimplifying here, but so apologies to the hydrologists on the call here. But if that water isn't low enough in phosphorus, it can't be released into Everglades National Park. So a lot of water comes down. It goes into Conservation Area 3A, and then there comes time where there's so much water there that it has to be released. Hurricane season is coming, and it goes east and west out through the St. Lucie River, the Caloosahatchee River. And that tends to happen, and it's happened so many years in a row consistently at the time when snail kite young are leaving their nests for the most difficult part of their life. Now imagine being 6 weeks old and having to learn how to fly and catch snails in a matter of hours after you the nest. Of course, that would be pretty tough for us to do. It's easy for them, but they don't know that. They have never done it before. So that's a critical time for them. And it's the time in the snail kite's life that they're most likely to die. Post-fledging mortality in any bird is much higher than at any other time they'll ever face. So we got interested in snail kites in 2007 because Tylen Dean, now resource manager of Everglades National Park, was in the Vero Beach Office of Fish and Wildlife Service, and he was about to leave. And he said, I've got this money I've got to manage, and I'm looking for somebody to get started studying snail kites with telemetry because it wasn't being done as part of the monitoring, a very impressive large-scale monitoring program that's been run by a UF team now directed by Dr. Rob Fletcher. As is the water management process and dynamics in Florida, especially South Florida. The monitoring program for snail kites is incredibly impressive. It's very effective. My only wish is that we would put as much effort into management and testing management and tweaking management so that we can perform conservation and sustain or increase species that are imperiled. So my only wish is that we don't just track the demise of species, but we apply what we learn in the process, all the data we collect, to putting refined, effective management practices out on the landscape. I don't think enough of that happens. And that's a statement from somebody who should have retired, could have retired several years ago. And at this point, I know I will. I can't do this forever, but I can't do the bureaucracy administrative. That's what's going to push me out. But, I really want to see the data that we've collected on all these species, and especially the most imperiled, put to use. And that is the one thing that I would fault us for as a society. We are not holding our wildlife conservation management agencies, state and federal, we're not holding their feet to the fire on this. Now, it doesn't mean it's an easy job. It doesn't mean that their job would be threatened if they did what they knew was the right thing. I don't know what it's like to be in that position, although when they say, well, Meyer, you don't have to worry. You're not a public employee. My reply is, I work for the public. I work for all of you folks. And if you're not happy with what we're doing, we don't see any donations. We don't see the kind of things that keep us going. But to be honest with you, the funding scene for the kind of work that you're seeing me describe here, it disappeared a long time ago. The only reason ARCI is still going is because we do those subcontracts on species like the caracara and snails. We work for the Army Corps studying apple snails. And we make enough money doing that we can do other things for imperiled species. And that is try to provide data that will contribute to management if someone would just pick it up and use it that way. I should say some of my best friends, most admired colleagues, people I love and really respect work for these agencies. And I don't mean anything personal in this at all, except for the very, very small handful of people who have just been total abominations to work with, and including right up to today. So I won't go there. But here's a picture of snail kite stuff. Color bands helps you recognize individuals. This is the basis of US amazing monitoring program. Upper left there, you see different representations of home ranges and from snail kite data. The thing about snail kites is when you look at their behavioral ecology, they're like raptor. And I'll show you, well, you can see some of the tracks here. So this is Gina and David Whitmer from Palm Beach County Environmental Resource Management, helping Gina put a transmitter on a snail kite that they were tagging on lands in Palm Beach County. But look at this map here. This is the tracks of 5 different snail kites in wetlands in South Florida. I'm going to show you bigger pictures of all these, but here's Gina in a kayak. That is her modus operandi for catching snail kites. That's her vehicle of choice. Less expensive than a helicopter, that's for sure. And that trap is something that we invented back in 2007. So it's a PVC square with a piece of black window screen mesh hanging down, bagging below there. And there's live snail there. But on transects that go across in lines, parallel lines across this box or this frame, are fishing lines on which are attached fishing monofilament nooses that will catch the toes and the little feet of snail kites. Well, they're not so little. The toes have long talons, and that's what often gets caught. So the idea is you find a snail that's foraging from a perch, you watch it a while, you wait for it to leave the perch, paddle over, put this trap down, paddle back. Obviously, you can't get out of sight. The snail kite doesn't care. They're pretty approachable. And if they come down and they get their feet caught, we can put transmitters on them and collect data like this. This is 9 adult snail kites that we tagged in 2020. I think we've done 32 at this point. It's expensive to do this stuff, but you might wonder, why are you spending people's money to do this? And the whole idea was it wasn't being done, and we didn't have this representation, this benefit of seeing, well, where are snail kites going when they're not where we're used to seeing them, in accessible wetlands? And so these birds were tagged everywhere from Payne's Prairie up here, a few miles from where I'm sitting, down to Loxahatchee Slough, Lake Toho in the upper Kissimmee Basin. And that's what the tracks look like. Now, those are straight lines between fixes that were taken every 2 hours. The flights, of course, are more circuitous. But here's, when you look at all the places we've had snail kites report GPS fixes, 114,000 remotely sensed locations, 31 adults in this case, tracked for 13, 14 years, collected by satellite and cell phone tracking systems. So that's a lot of data. And when you look at that overlaid on where snail kites actually spend most of their time, or I'm sorry, forget I said that, where snail kites spend their time in relation to the crosshatch red areas, which are areas that are considered critical habitat for snail kites. And this is where the monitoring and what little management happens, this is where that occurs in these areas, Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades, up here in the Kissimmee chain of lakes, these little patches. But look at where the kites are spending most of their time. At least 60% of the breeding season GPS locations in this picture were outside the areas managed and monitored for snail kites. Over 80% of the breeding season locations were outside these areas. In 2015, over a 6-year period was the 60% thing. So that says to me that if we're going to manage for snail kites, maybe we should look in places where we don't look for them all the time because they're not there all the time. There's a lot that we could say about that and where that would go, but I think this picture and this picture should give us hope for snail kites. We have this incredible finesse for manipulating water levels in this big landscape. And we have birds moving around like this, looking for it. You know, if you look at the tracks, let me go back to here. These birds, these are not migratory birds. These are nomadic birds. They make these long moves at any time of year, and they may go from their home range, their territory, nesting territory, all the way down to here one day and back the next. And what they're doing, and they're doing this too, they're not going in a straight line. What we think they're doing is they're checking out the landscape. What are the water conditions elsewhere? They know these places because they have been there before. Just pick one color and look at how much of Florida it covers. So from the top of this picture to the bottom is the entire US range of snail kites. And all these birds are eating snails, and how deep you have the water in a given place for how long determines how many snails you're going to have. I don't mean to be silly about this and oversimplify, but you know, there's a hell of a lot of very smart people managing water, but they are under so many constraints because of conflicting demands for the water. And literally, I think if they did what they knew was the right thing, they would lose their jobs. And all I could say is, I'll help pay for the lawyer to get it back. And there are organizations that will do that. So I'm not encouraging you to do that, but I'm saying, how else are we going to fix this problem? So you might wonder, how precarious are snail kites? There's over 3,000 individuals now. Well, they were down in the 200 individual range, supposedly, when snail kite research started. But snail kites have been listed for over 50 years now, and they're still on the endangered species list. So when you look at the history, they have had some enormously precipitous and long-lived population declines. And what Rob Fletcher's team has discovered, and this is valuable information, is in 2007 and 2008, we had a severe drought, followed a severe drought in 2002 to 2004. Those two droughts back to back, and each of those droughts being very, very strong in 2 successive years, caused this population to plummet very quickly. And what was happening was whole entire seasons of reproduction were being wiped out because remember, these snail kite young, when they leave the nest, they have to learn to fly, learn to catch snails, and feed themselves. And when water is sinking at that time of year, they don't have much time. And sometimes time runs out for most of them. And an entire year's production, 90% of a year's production, off the top of my head, I don't think that's exaggerating at all, could be lost. Now, if that only happens in 1 year, the population can start recovering the next year. But what Rob's found, looking at their monitoring data, when that happens even just in 2 years, that successive year, they're trying to breed in a year that's already not a lot of young have come into the breeding population because they didn't survive the previous year. And then they're going to send out even more surviving young that year. That's when things start happening quickly. Now, you'd have to be pretty hopeful to think that that's not going to catch up with snail kites eventually. And that's why I think their status, their future and their status is quite precarious. And I think we need to start thinking of ways to become, even if we just can only do it on paper and not actually implement it. If we can show that we can manage these wetlands, I'm looking for a good map, so I'm just going to stick with this. Okay, so imagine this. I've shown you in these maps where the wetlands are that they're using, but not all these wetlands have to be producing a lot of snails at any given time for snail kites to have a stable population. And that's critical. I don't know what percentage it is, but it's less than half of the major wetlands that can produce a lot of snails, enough for snail kites. They don't all have to be on and being highly productive of snails at the same time. So to my mind, that gives us some leverage. We have some options. And with all the STAs, stormwater treatment areas now, storage areas that are coming online of different designs. One of the Caracara projects we're doing, we're tracking breeding adults that are going to be displaced by a sort of a pan flow, a shallower flow than what would normally feed an STA. Anyway, it's another kind of water storage where nutrients are being pulled, especially phosphorus, being pulled out of the water as it sits on this landscape. In this case, a landscape that's north of Lake Okeechobee, and it's becoming cleaner and getting toward the quality that can be released eventually down into the Everglades. So we do have options to move water around and even sit down and just brainstorm and say, okay, next year, what are weather conditions look like? It's hard to predict how wetlands are going to be in the coming year because it's rainfall driven. It's not like Connecticut, you know, rainfall down here, you know, in Hartford to be this different from Danbury because this is what, you know, that doesn't work that way. So I think we have the opportunity to try to be creative, at least on paper, and say, where can we put water so that enough places are on for snail kites enough of the time. Unfortunately, the Fish and Wildlife Service chose a different strategy for the last 2 decades, and that is somewhere there is snail kite nirvana. And if we can just manage that one place, we will have enough snail kites. So at one point, it was the upper Kissimmee chain of lakes, Lake Toho, East Toho, Lake Kissimmee. At another point, it was Lake Okeechobee. And none of those places had the right water conditions more than 2, maybe 3 years out of, say, a 5-year period. Now, they don't have to as long as other places are picking up the slack, but we can't expect them to. The system doesn't work that way, and snail kites evolved in that system. They're used to that, and they can cover long distances. Now, why don't you see snail kites flying overhead when they're on their way to somewhere else? Well, what's cool about GPS tracking is you get altitudes. They go up over 1,000, 1,500 feet, especially in the summer. They can ride up on thermals really quickly, and you don't know. You know, you might have friends come down and say, oh, I've never seen a snail kite, show me a snail kite. And you go down, you know, Everglades somewhere and you go to some famous place. Well, we're not looking up. There's snail kites up there doing exactly what you see in this map. So they're capable of doing it. I'm going to keep moving here. I hope you get the picture. I don't think this is beyond our reach, but it's certainly beyond our reach the way we're behaving now to manage for snail kites more securely. What we did in 2012, we had money from the Fish and Wildlife Service to study copper and snail kites. So I am watching the clock. It's 8 o'clock, and I'm aiming to finish soon. We have one more species to talk about after this, but that'll go quicker because it's a small bird, so it'll go faster. So I got interested in mercury because we had money to study copper because copper is used as uh, used as a fungicide in citrus groves. I think I'm getting that right. Right. So there's a lot of elemental copper out there on the landscape, unbound out there in the substrate, and that's risky for birds. In chickens, the experiments were done in chickens. It suppressed reproduction in chickens in fairly small amounts. So there was interest about what's this copper doing when we're putting water storage and treatment areas out on the landscape, and there's copper because there used to be citrus groves there. So in one sentence, here's the result of the copper study, and it's nice to be able to give you some good news. We caught snail kites, and we collected blood, a small number of body coverts, well, 2 or 3, a small amount, and we collected feces. We collected blood and feathers deliberately. We collected feces by holding a baking pan, like something you'd make biscuits on, underneath the snail kite while we were attaching a transmitter to it, and they would defecate right there in the baking pan, and we'd put that into a bottle. So we had 3 samples. Well, what it turned out was there was no copper in snail kite feathers. There was none in their blood, but there was copper in their feces. Now, people simultaneously were looking very closely at snails and how snails move copper. Well, what snails do is, whether they know it or not, they create these little crystalline calcium structures that sequester the copper. So when the snail kites eat the snails, those little structures pass through the snail kites, and that's how we were finding them. But they weren't detrimental to the snail kites because they weren't toxic while they were in those little crystalline structures. I thought that's one of the coolest things I've ever learned. And if I could see you, you'd be smiling and nodding. So I'll just assume you are. So while we had birds in the hand, we did 2 things. We took a little extra blood, and we really underdo it on the blood. You could take a lot more than we ever do. Mercury sample. And the other thing we did was put transmitters on a subset of them, satellite GPS ones, and then eventually cell phone GPS ones. So I'm going to show you, I won't show you. Here's the mercury results, this map on the left. Yellow, the light colors are the lowest concentrations of mercury, the darkest are down in the Everglades. And everybody knows now, incredible toxicological work done by very bright minds. The center of abundance for mercury is right here in Conservation Area 3A. And that's because of atmospheric conditions and deposition and rainfall of mercury that's up there, because it's been released in smokestacks around the world, because of medical waste, and because of batteries, both of which we're getting a grip on. Dave Krabenhoff is a rock star of studying mercuries with USGS. And I heard him give a talk in the Everglades conference that happens every 2 years, GEAR. And he said, but something else we need to be worried about. This is Florida. A lot of old people, a lot of people get cremated, and a lot of them have mercury fillings in their teeth. And he said that has become a measurable contributing source of concern. So what happens in Florida is the mercury goes up into the atmosphere, but the reason it's concentrated in South Florida, the deposition, is it comes down in the rainfall because we have these incredible cumulus clouds, if you haven't noticed, in the summertime, thunderstorms. And the tops of those clouds go up to 20, 30, 40,000 feet or more. So they're bringing stuff down with them. It's a convection. Air goes up, it picks up stuff in the upper atmosphere, and it comes down, and the rain brings that stuff down. When the 3 days before this fall, he said, we just had 36 inches of rain in Hollywood and Fort Lauderdale, and the tops of the cumulus clouds producing that rainfall were over 60,000 feet. He said the deposition of mercury in Florida is not going to end anytime soon. He said it's likely that it could increase because with climate change, we're making everything hotter, and those thunderstorms are convecting much higher up in the atmosphere. All of this is connected. Remember the first Earth Day? What was the message? It's all one. It's all connected. Well, it sure is. And we're paying the price for not listening at this point. So we're about to start a study of methyl mercury because elemental mercury is not as dangerous as the methylated organic form. That's what really causes aberrant behaviors. These levels down here, if they have high mercury, and again, this is just total mercury, we have to get the percent of methyl mercury before we know, but they could have enough mercury to suppress, well, in Carolina wrens, that level of mercury caused a 30% reduction in nesting success. That's alarming. So there's no more kites nesting in Everglades National Park to speak of, or Conservation Area 3A. And I think that's attributable to water management destroying snail populations. And snails, okay, so why do snails disappear from Conservation Area 3A? It's because put too little water there for too long, or enough water there for too short a time. I'm sorry. So that snail, native apple snails, have one reproductive year in their life, one reproductive season in their life. They only live 1.5 years or so. Exotic non-native snails live longer and they have more reproductive cycles. But for native apple snails, if they have a bad year and all the water gets sucked out and goes to big sugar, and that's not hypothetical, and there's not enough water down here in mid-May because it's being drawn out, then native apple snails, that they can have a whole year's reproduction wiped out because the water is gone before the breeding season finishes. That means they have many fewer snails going into the next breeding season. And when that happens too many years in a row, you wind up with what we have in 3A. And we measure them every year for the Army Corps, and it's not enough to support snails. The densities, it's just unbelievably low. So moving on, what does methyl mercury do? Well, one thing it does is cause embryo mortality in eggs. So how would you know that it's affecting snail kites when the nests are out there and they're failing, and then they're being abandoned as they are in Conservation Area 3A in Everglades National Park, where there's not enough water? They're failing, but they also could be failing because the eggs are not hatching. Okay, there you go. Thanks to all these great people. I hope some of you know some of them, but I'm going to move along here. I think I'll just leave you with that thought. Wouldn't it be cool if we could just secure the future for this bird, because we would be protecting the ecological integrity and the future of water in Florida. There's enough for everybody. You know, when there's too much water in the system, a whole lot of it winds up out in the ocean, and that's unfortunate. That's a much more intricate story than is suggested by that glib comment. Um, that's true in some important cases. I should go back here. I particularly want to thank the Palm Beach Zoo and Gardens, Margot McKnight, the director there, for supporting so much of the work I've been talking about so far with snail kites, and for swallowtail kites as well. But all these people have been wonderful and very, very helpful. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here talking about the American kestrel, but I'm going to talk about a particular subspecies, the one that occurs in Florida. The Southeastern American kestrels in Florida, used to be in Georgia, South Carolina in greater numbers, probably not breeding in South Carolina at all, and more barely holding on in southern Georgia, southeast Georgia, barely holding on in Florida and Alabama and Mississippi. 30% decline since 1970. So 4 years ago, we were bequeathed a sum of money that enabled us to start doing some telemetry research on Southeastern American kestrels. And those funds came from Mary and James Dowdell, who at different times were presidents of Hernando Audubon. Mary worked on red-cockaded woodpeckers for FWC. She was Roger Torrey Peterson's assistant, administrative and et cetera assistant. Incredibly wonderful person, driven by incredible draw to conserve birds. And when a few days before she passed away, she told me that there was going to be something coming our way. And I said, what would you like to see us do? And she said, please study kestrels, because it isn't being done and there's no There's no hint that it's going to be done soon enough, and they're declining. So remember, this is a state listed bird. It's on the short list of threatened birds in Florida. Small but mighty. Yep, smallest raptor, size of a blue jay. Very, very light. Strong feet for their size, the strongest. They can really inflict some pain with those little talons when you're trying to ban them. And they're fast, and they're small, but there's so many because the continental wintering population comes down here to Florida. So they're all over North America, not as much as they have been. They're declining everywhere throughout their North American range. It used to be that Florida had the fastest rate of decline, but that appears to not be true anymore. It's sort of moved toward the moderate rate of decline in Florida. The Northeast is seeing the highest rates of decline, and then various areas in the Midwest and the West. The Peregrine Fund has a Kestrel project partnership, and they collect nest box data. And they're putting a lot of effort and money and bright minds into trying to figure out why this population, why the American kestrel as a species is declining steadily. It's very alarming. There's probably 7 or 8 likely possibilities, and maybe it's a little bit of all of them, but losing nesting habitat, they nest in cavities, is one of the things. And another is that they feed on, a large part of their diet is insects, and insect populations are crashing. And we all know that that's because we're losing the habitats and the native plants that insects need. And I'll come back to this point in a few minutes. And it's one way I've found to end talks and actually be happy when I'm done. So yeah, 30% since 70. Suitable nesting and foraging habitat, some combination of that. And then I started to think, well, why maybe perhaps the declining trend has declined in Florida, or has slowed in Florida. Why are they seem to be appearing or disappearing at a slower rate? And I just wonder a little bit if with climate change, the proliferation of non-native reptiles like Cuban anoles replacing green anoles, the native anole, unfortunately. But when you watch kestrels at nest boxes in central and north central Florida, and probably even more so in South Florida, you see them bringing a whole lot of anoles. And we just had some amazing information, swallowtail kite study that we did on Sanibel for years before it got so heavily destroyed from the hurricane last year. So we had 5 nests of swallowtail kites in Australian pines on Sanibel for several years, thanks to the great people who work there and were finding them and monitoring them for us. And we were tracking these birds and they had good survival. Well, this year, there's not much left of the vegetation on Sanibel Island, but those 5 pairs of some kind came and nested again on Sanibel Island, and they did well. And they even stayed a little bit longer than everybody else because we track swallowtails as they're migrating out. And what was notable was the local volunteers, observers from Sanibel Captiva Audubon Society and others, they were noting that the kites were catching a lot of night anoles and curly-tailed lizards or curly-tailed skinks. I think it's skinks, not native species, but the kites were nailing them. They were finding them in the vegetation that had been broken down and was more accessible. So anyway, I tell you that just as hope it brings a little smile to your face. So they eat insects and they eat small vertebrates, but they also can eat birds. Females are bigger than males. That's true in almost all species of raptors. So females have a broader range of prey available to them. John Smallwood, one of my kestrel heroes, he's now teaching up in New Jersey, but he was in Florida for a long time, did incredible nest box study, meticulous work, wonderful, beautiful person. So he's given us all kinds of great knowledge of kestrels. And what he's finding in New Jersey, he put up nest boxes when he moved up there to teach years ago. He would typically have 70% occupancy in his nest boxes. It's down to 16% in the last few years. And what he and other people up there are seeing with nest box cameras is that the young are getting fed more by females, and the females are bringing more small songbirds than kestrels usually catch. If they can nail a small songbird, that's a great catch to bring back to a nest and feed. They sometimes have broods of 5 or 6 birds. So that's what they're doing to hang on up there. But occupancy from 70% to 60% of nest box occupied, that's really scary. In Florida, it's called the Southeastern American Kestrel because it stays in the Southeast, presumably. It's thought to be non-migratory, although people have noticed in various ways that they aren't at their nesting territories all year. So we have started studying kestrels, which we got some work going 4 years ago, theoretically, by scoping out places. But 3 years ago, we started work in Putnam County, west of Melrose, with the Santa Fe Audubon Society, and Bill Chitty, who is their program manager for the Kestrel Project. Incredible amount of beautiful work. They have a really high occupancy rate, a return rate to their nest boxes, and this is all on Bill. He knows how to place these boxes. He's been contributing all his time in the spring and summer to monitoring those boxes, and he readily agreed to work with us to radio track offspring in those boxes so we can answer a few very important questions that have never been addressed. I mean, here we are long into a decline with this species, and it is listed in Florida, and we lack basic demographic data that would help with management. So one of the things that we want to figure out with these radio tagged young is how well they survive their first year, or at least that first 90 days after fledging. That's so critical, because how is their survival compared to other populations? If survival is extremely low and declining, then the recruitment to the breeding population is going to decline, and there's only one, it's all down from there, unless we can turn that survival around. So what is their survival? But also, really important question for managing kestrels in Florida, where we have oceans on 3 sides. Well, where should we put our nest box effort? We should put it in good habitat. And what you see here are 2 pictures of good habitat for kestrels in Florida. One of them remains good habitat, short grass where the kestrels can hunt, critical because of grazing. And the other one, because if we're lucky, it enjoys prescribed fire at least every 1 or 2 years, 3 at the most. And that's critical to maintaining these beautiful pine savannas that are native to Florida as kestrel habitat. So I'll come back to the telemetry thing in a second, but what we're real interested in learning besides survival is how do they move when they fledge? What are they doing? And what it looks like, they go a lot farther. That's a clue of what we're finding. And after this year, we'll try to release some of this stuff, but we don't want to do it prematurely and not be sure we know what we're talking about. But the distances the young are going within 2 weeks of fledging are really quite large. So we want to learn more about that, but the critical thing is, what is natal dispersal? Natal dispersal is where they nest in relation to where they were born. The only estimate in the literature is 3 miles. Already we see the birds doing exploratory moves that are 10 times that. So we want to learn about how far they are programmed to disperse, because that would indicate to us, and what habitats they're settling, that would indicate to me where to focus nest box effort. And that's a volunteer driven activity that can really do enormous good for kestrels. This is a place where you really can do good if you're interested in helping this bird. If you do it with advice and guidance, and you do it smartly, and you keep the boxes in good shape, and you make them to certain specifications. And we can tell you all about that. Call me anytime. And there's a lot of other people who can tell you too. Hawk Mountain has studied kestrels forever and ever. So anyway, here we go. Cavities. This is what they nested in before people gave them nest boxes. They nested in dead trees. Cavities that were made by woodpeckers, and then when they were large enough for a kestrel to get in the entrance and lay eggs, that's what would happen. Another place that but kestrels historically in the Southeast nested in abandoned cavities of red-cockaded woodpeckers. Now, as you know, red-cockaded woodpeckers build little resin wells above their nests and below their nests, and the resin, the sap runs out, and it makes it very sticky, and it discourages predation. So when an RCW cavity is abandoned, often it's because another woodpecker, larger woodpecker, has started to open it up, or the resin has stopped flowing. Maybe the tree has died. So they nest in live trees, and they nest in cavities that were made by other species and enlarged. You know, they might be made by a downy woodpecker, and then there'll be a fire, and there'll be a short spell where there's some hairy woodpeckers there. But pileated woodpeckers will make the entrance bigger, and the kestrels will use the cavities. No management attention or interest is being directed at helping the birds do better in natural cavities. There are manipulations we could do. There are fire regimes that would help. And it's just not being done. I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but you know, none of us have a lot of time, and planet Earth is right up there with us on that list. So boxes can help a lot if they're put in the right places, if they're cleaned, helps greatly if they're monitored. And we have a nest box working with Hernando Audubon, which we started in 1992, tagging birds. My colleague down there is Marcy Clutter, and she was monitoring a pair at a school in Brooksville, the Challenger K through 8 math and science magnet school, and pretty big landscape, athletic fields close by. I imagine herbicide, pesticide spraying might be reduced, I hope, that close to the school. Kestrels nest there. They were nesting in the drain tubes coming out the side of the roof of this building for years. And in some years, people were noting that there were 2 broods of young. So we put up a box there, and I don't have a picture of it, but at the school, so the kids can see it, and we give talks, and the teachers can take advantage of the fact that this is happening right outside. And 3 years now, out of the last 3 years, this pair at that box has produced a second brood. And in both cases, most of those young, 7 to 8 young per year, most of them survived because we tracked them with transmitters. Most of them survived through the critical first 30 days and into the 60 and 90-day period. So that's really gratifying. This is what the transmitter looks like. This is a battery-powered VHF transmitter. We're now using, I don't want to say more sophisticated because this is a great tool, but solar-powered they're not GPS, solar-powered cell phone transmitters that triangulate on towers and infer a location from real slick algorithms. And we get those data, and on a coarser scale than you get with GPS, but given how far these birds are moving, we're learning amazing things very quickly. Those cell phone transmitters are a little too big to put on a male, so we're putting them on the females, and we're putting old-fashioned VHF on the males. We're actually getting the better data from the VHF radios because we fly to find them. And this real quickly. Survival at this point, at 90 days out, is higher than we expected to see in what's supposed to be a declining population. We'll see how that holds up over years. But the other thing, as I noted, is these long distances that they are going to nest, whether that means they will disperse that far to have their own first family, or that's just exploring the landscape. Something we learned in a collaboration with UF on snail kites. They asked us to join them in the first 2 or 3 years of a study tracking juvenile snail kites. We had only done, ARCI only done adults. And so we did that, and those data were really interesting. The tracks of the juveniles right out of the nest and in their first year and within the first 60 to 90 days were bigger. They were making longer movements than adults because we had all this archived adult data to compare it to. So I wonder if with kestrels, they're making these really long moves right out of the nest box. Maybe they're mapping the landscape. They're looking for resources. They're looking for other kestrels, especially of the other sex. So yeah, we're looking forward to seeing how all this unfolds. So these are not kestrels, of course, but what's the connection? Well, kestrels eat insects. And what happens when you plant native plants Well, you'll see insects in your yard, as you all know if you're doing this, that you have either never seen before or haven't seen in a long time. But the most amazing thing to me is how quickly they find your native plant garden. I mentioned Marcy, she's my collaborator on the Kestrel stuff and a dear friend, and this is her house. Now, these are all native plants. And now you might think she's lived here a long time. Those plants, she planted all those plants. I helped her dig some holes, but she's the one and kept the watering going. But she planted all those plants less than 11 months ago. That could be your yard. And when you pull up in the driveway and get out, the air is just buzzing with all the cool little animals pollinating those plants. Now, you may not believe this, but in June, after swallowtail kites leave their nest, the adults, they're off the hook. They start wandering. They're getting ready to migrate to Brazil. They're eating a lot of insects. I came by one morning to visit, and I saw a swallowtail kite in the distance. There was a route it used because it had a nest over near a lake, so a third of a mile away. I saw that kite flying lower than usual, and it came right over this yard and turned low circles over these plants. And I thought, oh, come on, kites are eating insects. That's how they get fat to migrate. And I thought, oh, that kite, there's no connection. About 2 weeks later, I gave a talk at a Wild Birds Unlimited store in Orlando. Great audience. And they all, I think I'm telling you something new and I tell you about native plants. A large number of you are doing this. So this audience started telling me about, oh yeah, we've got three nurseries. One's only 5 minutes away. I've got this plant and I've got that. I'm seeing this. And somebody said, well, beat this. I've got a swallowtail kite that has nested somewhere nearby and it comes over and catches insects, low altitude over my native plant gardens. I'm sold. So here's some dune sunflower on the right and some, I like calling it frog fruit. It's called frog fruit or fog fruit, but that's out there in the yard in the bigger picture I showed you. That's the close-up on the left. And frog fruit supports 3 species of cinereous butterflies, but it also supports the Phaon crescent. So Phaon crescents, I don't think eat or lay on, they might eat from dune sunflowers, but this is the object of its affection. That little frog fruit flower is what these little animals gorge on. And this was just last week. Marcy had Phaon crescents pupating all over the front screen of her house. They were on the screen door. The caterpillars were going between the door and the wall and getting into her porch, and she'd come out in the morning and they'd be pupating on the inside of the screen of her porch. So, I mean, look at all the fun you could have by having native plants nearby. What else can you do to help, specifically about kestrels? Of course, talk about it. Be joyful. Spread the news. Spread the gospel. Support organizations that purchase land and join Audubon societies to learn more, especially ones like this that really need your support, financial and otherwise, to do the things you're doing. And nest boxes. It's you got to do it right, but it's not hard to learn, and it's enormously rewarding. So, I hate to say that. I got to say, it's all in our hands. It really is, and we are running out of time fast. If you ever thought that climate change wasn't a real thing, well, I hope you've changed your mind. And I hope if you think there's nothing we can do about it, I hope you change your mind real soon, because there is, and we need to start really fast because they really are watching. And it's true. I first saw that on a t-shirt. It was bees talking, but you certainly get the picture. Thank you all very, very much. You're a great audience, even though I can't see or hear you. Happy to take questions.
I laughed at all your jokes, Ken.
Oh, gosh, Natasha.
All right, so we do have quite a few comments and questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and start at the beginning. So when you were talking about the magnificent crested caracara, Dr. Morrison added a comment saying that we like the term mate for life, but we have data that show one of a pair switching territories. These switchers are mostly females, maybe looking for a better partner. Do you have anything to add to that comment?
No, we haven't tracked both members of a pair much at all since then. It's been single birds. That's great information. Real interesting. What does she mean by better? I'd be curious to think why. That would take deeper study or philosophicalizing or something. But you know, why do you? Yeah, really. Um, Maybe
I
she's watching. More
I
prey
think
delivers.
she's still logged in. Joan, if you have anything to add, go ahead and throw it in the chat. Um,
That's great. I love it.
and then she also added that when you were talking about the different territories of the Caracara pairs, she noted that there was very little overlap in the territories between the pairs, which is a really interesting, and it's an incredible thing to like see on those maps how the territories don't really overlap. It really shows that, you know, they are territorial, they will use that space, and it's really cool to have those data.
Yes. And they avoid confrontation. They don't bother crossing. They save energy. It's an agreement. Isn't that
It
amazing?
it's amazing. It's really cool. All right, so Gwen Hayes has a question. I'm not sure if you're going to be familiar with this snail kite rookery, but she wants to know how effective is the snail kite rookery in West Palm Beach off of the Oahe Trail? Are you
Is that the
familiar with that?
one? Yeah. Is that near the waste management facility?
I believe that is the one, yes.
Yeah. How effective is it? Well,
Maybe effective or successful is a good way to look at it.
yeah. I guess it's successful if the birds that roost there enjoy maybe better foraging success by following each other in the morning. There's this old thing that goes back to when I was in grad school. I mean, that was there was a lot more than cell phones we didn't have then. But the idea of the information center that birds, why do they gather in communal roosts? And one thought is, well, a lot of them might be related, at least at the cousin or second cousin level. And by helping each other, they're furthering their own genes, and they can help each other by noticing who's looking particularly good today, or you seem to, what are you feeding? Or there might be some behavioral cues that a bird has been successful. So in the morning when they get up and go out, certain birds might follow other birds and they go to food sources they were not aware of. So information exchange. If that's happening, then any roost is a good thing and something to certainly protect. That's cool. It's been there a while. Mary Beth Morrison has been keeping track of the numbers there and sending them around to everybody.
Yeah. Margot Booth she was an employee with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She just said she hopped off the program early. Have a good night. The next question is from Jeannie Mauser. She wants to know, what is the life expectancy of a snail kite?
That'd be a good question for Rob. Guessing I would say same for swallowtails, 12 to 15, 20 years, 25 years, could be some older individuals. Snail kites older than swallowtails because swallowtails have that really dangerous long distance migration. So another thing in snail kites' favor is they don't have to go real far and they can cover their whole range, their whole US distribution in a day and a half and scope out resources. So I bet they live longer. Yeah.
All right. Jackie Solik would like to know, are snail kites breeding at sweetwater wetlands successfully?
Sweetwater wetlands in Payne Prairie. I'm so glad you asked, Jackie. And I'm going to come back because I wanted to say something about you. Something nice, very nice. Sweetwater wetlands, Payne's Prairie. So I was at these meetings happen like 4 times a year. Multi-species management, Fish and Wildlife Service organizes them, and all water managers come, and biologists are asked to share information about their water-dependent species. so that water managers can try to do some good. And these are amazing people, not only in how smart they are and the stuff they're capable of thinking about, but how willing they are to try to help. I will say it appears that their offers to help are not accepted very often because these things don't happen. But we get to tell them what the birds need. And someone said who'd been coming to this meeting for a long time, he's an FWC land manager, Beecham Fergus, or Fergus. He said, well, what will you guys tell us what you're doing on Payne's Prairie so we can do it in the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes and we can do it in South Florida? Because every year, almost every year, Payne's Prairie is on and producing a large number of nests. What is going on? And there was dead silence. And I said, they're not pulling the water out from under the birds when they're ready to fledge. It's a totally different system. They're not sending that water anywhere. And nobody said a word. And somebody then said, oh yeah, but moving South Florida, we're moving the water for storm protection and flood protection. And we're moving it because of this and that. And nobody would say they were moving it because agriculture wants more water at that time of year. Evapotranspiration is happening. Levels are going down naturally anyway, and going down in croplands. And then that, I didn't say anything. People just kept saying, no, it's not agriculture. And then, I don't mean to get him in trouble, but Tyler Beck very quietly said, Ken's right. I immortalized that when I could put it in a picture on my wall, but it's so obvious. That's what's different about Payne's Prairie. We're keeping enough water there all year. Not deliberately, it just works out that way. So that's what I think. I wanted to mention that Marcy Clutter, with abundant help from Jackie Selleck, got a grant from Florida Audubon, Florida, and with money coming especially from Florida Power. And Marcy, like single-handedly, and some friends, put in something like 280 running feet of native plant gardens around the Challenger School in Brooksville, where we have that kestrel pole. And it is an incredible showpiece. And again, within 7 or 8 months, everything was blooming. There were insects there everywhere. So thank you, Jackie. And I know Marcy is really grateful. I would say this is I'll just make this point if you're interested in doing this kind of thing. You don't have to fertilize. There's a lot of things you don't have to do, but you do have to do some basic care, like water when it's really dry. And the hardest thing for Marcy is she couldn't get anybody to help. It's a big school. It's got a large student population, big PTA, and nobody could organize within the school enough volunteers to keep things watered. So she's driving 45 minutes each way to water stuff while she's still trying to grow her own yard. I'm not trying to get sympathy for her, but make sure you build that into the system if you're going to try to do a community kind of thing, that you're going to have that kind of support to maintain it. But Jackie, yeah, thank you. Awesome job on that. Okay, here we go. Natasha, any other questions?
Yes, so many more.
Uh-oh.
All right. Allison St. John would like to know, this was when you were talking about apple snails. Allison says, does it matter if the snail is invasive or indigenous?
They do have different ecology. The non-natives, as I said, might live 2, 3, 4 years. They're larger. Rob Fletcher's team found that snail kite bills have gotten longer over just a few generations, just like Galapagos finches, Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. Sorry, that change in the feeding structure happened in a very small number of generations because it was so valuable. You can get more food, you can make more babies. So yeah. I'm sorry. The question again was, what was the question?
Does it matter to the snail kite if the snails are native or non-native?
Yeah, okay.
And I will let you know, there was
It doesn't-
another follow-up question by Elwood Bracy, and Mark Cook did comment, and I'm just going to read you his comment since it relates to this conversation. Mark says that exotic snails almost certainly saved the snail kite when the population was dropping precipitously towards extinction in 2007. However, the exotic snail will not be beneficial in the long term for a number of reasons, including their slow extirpation of the native apple snail. So back to the original question from Allison of, does it matter if the snail is invasive or indigenous?
Yeah, well, it only matters. They tend to be bigger, so one catch is a bigger meal. I assume that I haven't tried it, but they probably taste similar. But boy, I want to come back to what Mark said because it would have taken me 20 minutes to say that, and that wouldn't have been as understandable. But one thing about the non-native snails, if we're concerned about pollutants, by living longer, they have more of a chance to bioaccumulate toxins, and that's not just metals. A whole other subject, avian vacuolar myelinopathy, AVM. It's a toxin, it's a disease that results from a toxin produced by blue-green algae, and it's proliferating in the east. It kills eagles, it kills scavenging birds, and it's in Florida. And so we're interested in if it's in snail kites. But it is in and causing mortality in bobcats and near mortality, maybe mortality in Florida panthers. And so Dr. Susan Wild at the University of Georgia, if you ever get a chance to hear her, incredible work that she has done and trying to alert people to this because humans can die from this too. It's a neurotoxin. And it's in so many things that are connected, that are in environments where there is hydrilla, and it is on hydrilla that the cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, grows and has this toxin. And so Susan called a couple of weeks ago and said, can you help me collect snails? Because I think bobcats and panthers in association with wetlands that have hydrilla are eating snails, and that's where they're getting this from. That's the pathway. And that's quite alarming. So another amazing story. But to go back to what Mark said, that's it. Yeah, non-native snails were great at first. But one thing that they're really causing problems with is all these sophisticated water treatment areas. And that's happened in Brazil where the snails are native too. And what happens is if there's too much growth from too much eutrophication, too much nutrient enrichment in any of these wetlands, and they have to be drawn down and scraped out, when they reflood them, there's a big pulse of phosphorus initially, and the snails that are left just proliferate enormously, really quickly, and it draws the snail kites. So is this good or is this bad? And that's what Mark's alluding to. Yeah, they haven't been good in the long term anywhere else, the non-native species, even where they are native, by the way.
All right.
Thanks, Mark.
It's a good answer for a very seemingly simple but complicated question.
You're so kind.
All right. The next question is from, it's more of a comment from Jeff Dorian. He said that the EPA officials estimated that about 50 tons of elemental mercury are emitted each year from U.S. coal burning power plants, with lesser amounts coming from oil and gas burning units. So that just went back to when you were talking about mercury in the air.
Okay, thank you.
Kevin Baker would like to know, is there a benefit to having less water in areas with too much mercury?
Here's a quick story. The water plays into the availability of methyl mercury. Now remember, that's the dangerous organic form. So there's methyl mercury in that marsh drop down. That methyl mercury reverts to the elemental form, the inorganic mercury form. And it can sit in the substrate and not become a problem forever and ever. When that site gets hydrated with rainfall, the elemental mercury remethylates. So yeah, that plays into the toxicity, is essentially the transport of methyl mercury. And that's why the Everglades, it gets more complicated, and it's amazing stuff. But the elemental mercury is converted to methylmercury, the more dangerous form, by sulfur. There's sulfur reducing bacteria are involved in that chemical process. And those bacteria happen to live in these warm, mucky environments in the Everglades. So that contributes to all this.
All right, so we have another seemingly simple but complicated question coming up. Mary Young, so on the board here of Audubon Everglades, would like to know, what are some of the most effective management practices that you would like to see implemented for the 3 species you spoke of tonight? And second part to the question, what can we do to encourage the various agencies to implement these practices?
Perfect questions. Let's see. I'll start with caracaras, and Joan would be a great one on this as well. They're losing nesting habitat. It's just disappearing rapidly, and there's no future in that. So we have to provide. We people have to let managers know that we would support providing protection for those critical habitats. Nobody thinks cabbage palms need protection, unfortunately, but they do where there are caracaras. We have to slow down this incredible growth of 10-foot between massive high density housing. And that's what's going to happen in the range of the Caracara. Most of that land is owned by one company, the Mormon Church, the Deseret Company. And it's cattle because for a long time, cattle will be the most productive, most lucrative. But as property values go up, there's a tipping point where that land becomes far more valuable to be developed, and that's what's going to happen. Fish and Wildlife Service, to a large amount of credit, they for years now have been working on 2 different novel types of national wildlife refuge systems, disjunct properties on the east and the west side of the Central Ridge. And it's the headwaters of the Everglades, essentially, but also the St. Johns River, which goes north. And they're protecting some amazingly wonderful pieces of land. So there's hope in that regard. So for caracaras, it's not all about, but that's really important. Figuring where the roosts are and why the birds roost where they do, and protecting those sites too. Harkens back to the question about the Palm Beach County snail kite roost. Snail kites, let's try to get the water right. Let's just look at it and say, okay, we only need 40% of these places to have, here's a catch, from 10 to 50 centimeters of water favors snail reproduction and snail kite access to the snails. Okay, so say this much. 60 to 100 centimeters of water up here favors kite nesting because it excludes predators from nests. Mammalian predators. So where in Florida that is so flat do you have those discontinuous intervals of water that the snail kite needs simultaneously, close enough so that it can both nest and forage? But I'm not, but people are smart enough to figure out where those places occur and what kind of management we might try to apply. Can we just do an experiment, even on a small scale? And another thing to think about is, I think about, where do those conditions even occur? Well, they occur in Conservation Area 3A. They occur in Grassy Waters Preserve, the drinking source of water for the city of West Palm Beach. That's massive and very pristine, and is always being threatened by development right now, as a matter of fact. So we've got those places. Well, so what you see in those places are those environments where there's heads of cypress. They may not be huge trees, but they're cypress domes that are small, and then a large swath of marsh and more cypress domes. And the kites like to nest on the outer trees of those cypress domes. So what do they have there? Well, as you know, around a cypress dome, the acidity of the foliage as it falls erodes limestone. And so cypress domes have moats around them effectively. The water is deeper. As you're walking down a marsh and say, I think I'll go in the dome and look around, the water gets deeper as you go toward the center of the dome. So here you have deep water that could be deep enough for nesting on one of those marginal, spatially marginal cypress trees, and you have snails within sight of that in the marsh. So there's one example right there of where we should protect water and habitat for snail kites. Kestrels. Well, think about bluebirds, we almost lost them. And think about what nest boxes have done for bluebirds. So that's one solution. Do it well, but let's do it thoughtfully. Let's get together and figure out a landscape strategy in Peninsular Florida where we should promote and even put public money into it and have public employees create colonies. And we are starting a project in Florida that will rely on telemetry data to try to create a model project that will do that from what may be a source population, building out onto adjacent lands in conjunction with all kinds of cool people who have been involved in conservation, from landowners raising cattle all the way up to successful conservation trusts. So that's what I think about for kestrels. Nest box programs, but protect the places where they are, and figure out what the weak link is, and stop poisoning insects. Neonicotinoids, that's responsible for the biggest crashes in insects and probably for bird declines across species. At least one of the major contributors. Sorry, I'll make the next answer shorter.
No, that was an excellent answer. Next, we have a comment from Greg Braun. Greg says, this was a great presentation, Ken. Thank you. I'm working on a land conservation project in southern Martin County, the Loxalucy Headwaters Initiative, in which we are acquiring undeveloped lands in the headwaters of the Loxahatchee, so the Kitchen Creek area, and South Fork of the St. Lucie River in southeast Martin County. He has seen snail kites foraging in the wetlands within their target conservation area, and he noticed on the map that you showed, you had one green track of a transmitter tagged snail kite that may have been in a tract that they have acquired for conservation. He asks that you please give him a call sometime, and he put his phone number and email in the chat for you.
Greg, thank you very much. There's my number.
Here, we'll
That's
email
cool.
you his contact info.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, we can send that to you.
He will email me.
We'll
so
email
the
it to you,
information's on the
unless Greg
screen.
is still on and he got that.
Oh, yeah.
All
I
right,
gotcha.
so
that's exactly one of the reasons why we're tagging snail kites, because we see that sort of thing, and it's real valuable. Thank you.
yeah, of course. Michael Raymond says that he used to see a kestrel behind his house, and in their neighborhood has a fair amount of tree canopy, but they don't see the kestrel anymore. Do you think a nesting box would encourage them to come back?
It very well could, if you have pasture or short grass of some kind within proximity. And then you would put the box out in it. It doesn't need, it'd be nice if it had some shade, but you don't want to put it too close to trees of any kind, because the trees can harbor predators. And a tree that's really too close, a rat snake will climb up the tree and then sling over and get on the box. They're, everybody knows how inventive they are getting into bird feeders. Yeah. Glad to talk with you and give you some suggestions, but look online too. I'm sorry.
So when you put up those nest boxes for the kestrel, speaking of the snakes, do you put any kind of snake guard on the base?
Yeah, usually. Yeah.
Sorry, that was a side question.
We also use, there's a neat design of a pole that Bill Chitty in Putnam, Santa Fe Audubon. It's called a mast chalice. It's an old sailboat building technique. So you can lower the mast of a sailboat at sea and repair it instead of writing a novel waiting for the wind to change. So it's a 2x4 that holds a nest box about 12 to 14 feet up, and it pivots, and it takes a couple of people to lower it, but as you bring it down, it's on a swivel. The box is on a swivel, so it always maintains its upright state. And so eggs are young, if you have to bring the box down to do something. Usually we only do it at the end of the season to clean it, but it makes it a lot easier to do than having it up on a pole. And because that's dimensional timber, rectilinear stuff, seems to be harder for snakes to get up. It's slick and it's not round.
That's awesome. Thank you.
They still do manage though, some of them.
They're very inventive, those snakes. They can get in places you wouldn't think. All right, the
Yeah,
next
they'll be
next
around the long
comment
term.
next comment is from Rhea Moss. She says the Florida Wildflower Foundation can provide numerous Zoom programs on Florida native plants. So that's just info for everybody out there. Alice
And what was
Turner
the
says
name of the
it was the
organization?
Florida Wildflower Foundation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Alice Turner says thank you. Dr. Morrison says, please support all efforts to save ranch lands via conservation easements or other mechanisms.
Amen.
Yeah, exactly. Kathy Ambach says, thank you so much. I learned so much from your talk tonight. Dr. Morrison, again, she says, she doesn't know, but territories where the birds left remained the same. So it could be the lever was looking for better real estate as well. We don't have any data about why they switched. So this is about the pairs, one bird.
Yeah, interesting.
That is interesting. Gwen Hayes again says, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Mary and Scott say, wonderful presentation and appreciate your candid assessment of our state's conservation efforts to help these listed threatened birds.
Thank you.
Mark Cook says, wonderful presentation, Ken, as always. We need to chat more about the water conservation areas and the kite. While hydrology has been an issue, I think some of those issues have been resolved, and yet the snail continues to decline or at least not recover. There's something impacting the decline of the snail that we don't fully understand. The non-native snail can cause declines of the population, but even accounting for that effect in the survivability is lower than expected. Perhaps some changes to the predator-prey relationships that we don't understand. They're working on this at Lila.
Cool. Thanks, Mike.
Yep. Joan Morrison again says USGS bird banding lab longevity records for snail kite is 14 years, 11 months. For swallowtail kite shows no longevity data. Ken, you should add some. So
We
you
have a
have a
lot of banded
to-do
birds
item.
out there. Yeah.
You have a to-do item now.
They live too long.
They live too long. Jackie says it's a treatment wetlands. It's a treatment wetlands that needs water to function. Mark has a question. Where is a good place to see southeast kestrels in South Florida?
Well, they used to be in a big cypress swamp and, heterogeneous habitat. They used to be in Everglades National Park. And they've been gone for a long time. The closest place, I don't know, maybe somebody else can answer, I'd be guessing, but there's no, when you look at FWC has a map of nest box effort, and it's all concentrated north of the I-4 corridor, well north of it, Marion County, Alachua County, south of there, but not too far south. So, that's close to home for some people in FWC, but it's there's habitat to the south of that. There's still so much rangeland, even though we're losing it. I'd like to see a lot more effort put there for kestrels, including not only nest box programs, but just education, outreach.
I sometimes will see kestrels when I'm working in Southern Hendry County.
Okay, yeah.
So we'll see them there sometimes.
And remember after early October, we're seeing wintering birds coming down from up north. And that's one reason that people weren't alerting themselves to the kestrel decline, because the bird is so numerous a good part of the year here, but we're not looking at the Florida population. And I know people, and I had this experience too. Last winter, I was not seeing as many wintering kestrels where I would normally see them. And we're having birds come down here from the Northeast where they're declining the fastest. It's scary when you start to see the impacts on that kind of a scale.
That is scary. Nancy Freeman says it's wonderful presentation. Thank you. And she wants you to know that she laughed at all your jokes as well.
Thank you so much.
Paula Guttrell would like to know, is there a place where people can purchase kestrel nesting boxes?
Yeah, and I can't remember the source, but there's one in particular that's really good. There you go. If you get in touch, though, I'll tell you. We just really like how they're made and how long they last. Um, Cedar is a really good choice. Cypress lasts pretty long, but it's real heavy. Um, Red cedar works real well.
All right, if you remember the place, just email it to us and we can share that information.
Okay, yeah.
Um,
Get it.
And then Sue Young would just like to point out to everybody that she doesn't think it's clear to the audience that kestrels don't nest in Palm Beach County.
Okay.
Yep. So then I had one question for you. And if there's any more questions, please put them in the chat. So can you just, I think it'd be interesting for people to hear a little bit about how you you said when you trap and tag Caracara. So can you kind of talk a little bit about like how you trap them? Like what's the process?
Well, there's two opportunities. I know most of Joan's trapping occurs during the nesting season, and she uses I think initially she used a live caracara as a lure to different kinds of nets. I know that now she uses a very large foot trap that comes over. So you put out bait, which is roadkill. So the first step is getting up at 2 in the morning and driving around, picking up roadkill and putting it in 3 thick garbage bags in the back of your truck and still having it smell up the neighborhood. And that's true. But you get roadkill, and so we trap them during the breeding season, but we also use different techniques outside the breeding season just to attract them to bait that's been put out for a week or two. And you let the birds start coming. And caracaras and vultures will both come. Vultures can really kind of mix things up. So one of the traps we use is called a bow net. Imagine a circle 6 feet in diameter, and you fold that in that. Yeah, you make a C, and it's got a net, and when it's spring loaded, and when the bird is safely in a center point, key information, you release the net, and that half of the net flips over and the net closes. And they will never, a bird that's never seen one of those will come and feed at a site for 2 weeks, and then we put that trap out, and it really isn't very showy at all. And the bird won't come back and feed anymore, even though they've never experienced getting caught in a trap. If they have, or if they've watched their mate get caught in a trap, the odds of you catching them go down to below 0. Very suspicious.
I like how
Smart.
suspicious they get. They do
Yeah.
get very suspicious. It's pretty cute.
Yes.
And then one more comment from Paul Davis. He says that kestrels are regularly seen on the Dyer Park old landfill in the wintertime here in West Palm Beach.
Oh, kestrels are.
Yep, that's what he said.
Nice. On a landfill.
It's an old landfill. Yeah, it's a park now.
Good.
It's a park now, but it was a landfill. They made it all pretty.
Yeah, that's the only kind of landfill I hang around would be old landfills. Well, that's neat. Yeah. Do you know, does he know what they're eating?
See if he puts it in the chat. But that's the last comment for right now. So
Well,
I
it's
just want to
about
thank you so
time.
much. I thought it was an excellent presentation. So thank you so much, Ken.
Thank
If
you
you want to
very
go ahead
much.
and stop sharing your screen.
No, I don't want to do that. I'm
Fine.
having fun. I don't want to do that. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken. That was amazing, informative, entertaining. As Nancy Freeman said, I laughed at your jokes as well. Appreciate so much of your time that you gave to us tonight. It's 9 o'clock. Wrong screen. Hang on, I've posted the wrong screen. I've just been told. Stop Stop sharing, and I will reshare my screen again. Is this the right screen? Okay, is that it? Okay, got it. All right, for those of you who stayed on this entire time, thank you for staying on. I compliment your hardiness. Next month, again, we will have Think Like a Raven with Dr. John Marsloff on October 3rd. I hope to see you there. This should be a wonderful presentation. And if you'd like to join the book discussion, remember the link is in the chat to contact Blue Kaufman about joining that discussion. And have a good night. Hope to see you out at some of the trails or some of our field trips. Remember, you can see those on Eventbrite. And thanks for joining us final time. And take care. Good night, everybody.